Today's presentation will be given by Avery Goldstein, the David M. Knott Professor of Global Politics and International Relations. He's also the Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China and Associate Director of the Christopher Browne Center for International Politics at the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on international relations, security studies, and Chinese politics, and he has many publications. His books include Rising to the Challenge, China's Grand Strategy and International Security in 2005, The Nexus of Economics, Security, and International Relations in East Asia in 2012, co-edited with Edward Mansfield. And his articles have appeared in many of the best political science and international relations journals, International Security, Foreign Affairs, International Organization, and many others. Today he will be speaking on a topic which I'm sure is important to many of us, China's security concerns, the enduring link between external and internal challenges. Please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Mary. I want to thank Ina and also thank Yuan for inviting me to Michigan. Can everybody hear me in the back? Ina, can you hear me?
I forgot to turn this one off.
Yeah, I thought I was supposed to turn that one off. I'll keep talking and just let me know. Well, can you hear me in the back? Maybe that mic that's on my lapel is only for recording. Don't know. I'd be happy to put this one on. Okay. Yeah. So I'll just speak to the front row. All right. Yes, no, maybe. Okay. I'll keep talking, and I'll talk loud to start with. Like I said, I wanted to thank everybody who invited me. It's great to be at Michigan. I've never actually come here to give a talk, but I had a daughter who was an undergraduate here where she met her future husband, so I've been here a couple of times as a parent, but not as an invited guest. And the topic, obviously, talk about China and China's international relations. People are very interested in such things. I'm going to try to make my talk brief enough that there'll be time for questions, and I'll invite questions on anything having to do with what I talk about today, or at least tangentially related to it, but on China's international relations and foreign policy. Most times you show up for a talk like this on, at least since, say, the mid-1990s, the past couple of decades, people show up to a talk on China's international relations, and they expect the speaker to talk about China's rise, its implications for international security, international economic affairs. Everybody's focused on China's growing capabilities and what that strength suggests for international relations. And that's important. I mean, obviously, I think it's important. I've written articles and I've written a book about that topic. But what I want to talk about today is something what to me is a bit surprising, which is that China today is clearly stronger than it's been probably for centuries in terms of its security against external military threats. So externally, China's rather strong. But China's leadership's clearly very worried about security issues. Some of them are international security issues because every country worries about that somewhat. But increasingly, China's focused on domestic security concerns or internal security concerns. And that I can say that. Why should you believe me? Well, let me just toss out 3 data points. I know how much people at Michigan like data. It's not much in the way of data. First, in 2012, and these numbers don't come out all the time, but in 2012, the Chinese central government revealed information that indicated that its spending on internal security was most likely exceeding China's spending on its military. The second point is at the 3rd plenum of the 18th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, which was held in November of 2013, one of the big first announcements to come out of that meeting, even before the documents were released, was that China was establishing a National Security Commission, or sometimes called the State Security Commission. And that announcement comes out, and observers of China were very excited. They thought, finally, China will have the equivalent of the United States National Security Council, because a coordinating policy for China's government has been a very difficult problem in dealing with other countries. The name sounded like the American National Security Council, obviously in Chinese. But it was a mistake in perception. That's not what it was going to be, because immediately became clear as the Chinese themselves explained what this National Security Commission would do. And when the documents came out, it was even clearer that this was a commission that was going to principally focus on domestic security concerns. It was even in the 60-point communique that comes out, it was listed in the section on domestic affairs. So that's the second big point I'd make. The third, maybe more consequential in terms of real data points here, is since 2013, China has passed a raft of laws, 3 really important laws that suggest this focus on domestic security problems. One is the new national security strategy for China, which talks a lot about domestic security concerns. The second is the counterterrorism law in China, and for China, counterterrorism has a very important domestic focus. And third is the recently approved NGO law. And it might seem like that's got nothing to do with security, but those of you who know something about China and its anxiety over the role of NGOs operating in China, that very much has to do with the regime's security concerns. So the first big point here is that this focus on domestic security seems striking. But what I also want to suggest in this talk today, and I'll probably race through some of the points fairly quickly so I leave some time for questions, is that this concern about both external challenges but also internal challenges is not entirely new. In fact, ever since 1949, the regime has really thought about both the threats to the regime from abroad but also at home. And in order to do this, in order for me to discuss how the balance between these two kinds of security concerns has shifted over time and the connections between them, what I'm going to do is put this in the context of the changes in China's grand strategy. Because I think, I'll open up by telling you that I think, in fact, grand strategy is really the reason why there is this connection between the regime's external and internal security concerns. Now, I realize not everybody in here studies international relations or security affairs. So you may be wondering, well, like what is grand strategy? I can tell you that experts don't really have good definitions for grand strategy either. But I'm going to use a really simplistic one that's often used by the experts in this field. And it was offered by a political scientist at MIT, Barry Posen, when he said that grand strategy is a state's theory about how it can best cause security for itself. Not very sophisticated, but really that captures its essence. But then what does that have to do with, when it says cause security, what does that have to do with internal security? Well, the answer to that is that the security that states are trying to provide for themselves, not just China, but any state, is not just against the threat to the territorial integrity of the country and the physical survival of the population living there, but part of the security that a regime tries to ensure is its ability to exercise power within its borders and run its internal affairs as it sees fit. I mean, that's essentially what the exercise of sovereignty is all about from a political science perspective. And that draws attention immediately to why there is this connection for the Chinese leadership between external and internal security concerns. Because in terms of running the country the way they see fit for the People's Republic of China, since 1949, right down through today, the principal domestic concern for the regime, and indeed what the Communist Party these days calls one of its core concerns, is ensuring the preservation of the one-party dictatorship headed by the Chinese Communist Party. That is the top security concern of the regime, both international and domestic. If you had to rank these things, that's the one that counts most. And it's not just me saying that because I'm a mean foreigner or I'm anti-China. I was at a national security conference in Beijing a couple of years ago, and the Chinese themselves were saying this. It's no big secret. Everybody knows it. So what I'm going to do is explain how this concern and how external and internal security problems for China have been linked through the years. And I hope I can do this quickly enough. I'm not big on PowerPoint. I was glad to see that the new nominee to be Defense Secretary, General Mattis, Mad Dog Mattis, gave one of the first things he was known for having said was he thinks PowerPoint's making us stupid. And I thought, I kind of agree, but regardless, I'll use a little PowerPoint. I do use it in my teaching. I'm not that old that I don't know how to use PowerPoint. So aside from that graphic, let me warn you that what I put up here, it's not going to be a lot of words. It's really more or less to entertain those of you who may be drifting off. And also, because not everybody in the audience is somebody who pays a lot of attention to China's foreign policy, just so you don't get confused by some of the labels I'm putting on things. So let's go back to the decades of the Cold War very briefly. I'll try to keep that as short as possible. But I want to show you how there's this element of continuity in the linked internal and external security concerns. So going all the way back to the beginning, the 1950s is going to be in big chunks, very stylized. You know, this is not a detailed analysis of China's foreign policy. Many of you who follow these things know during the 1950s, China was a close ally of the Soviet Union. As Mao put it, China was going to lean to one side and sign the Sino-Soviet alliance. And part of the reason for this, there's your pictures, you know, Stalin at the beginning of the 50s, eventually succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev there. This was a period where China really feared for the survival of the regime because of an external military threat from the United States. And, you know, they had reason to worry. The United States was hostile to China, was the most powerful military in the Western Pacific. So they had a high concern about the external threat they faced. And the Chinese leadership fully understood that they themselves would really not be able to stand up to American military power, certainly once that included nuclear weapons, on their own. And so they turned to the Soviet Union to counter American power. That drives the overall grand strategy, which really is encapsulated by this idea, lean to one side. Meant not just in military terms, but in economic terms. The Chinese economy followed the Soviet development model at first and was integrated in the Soviet economic bloc in the 1950s. But those of you who know about China, well, before I get to that, when I say low internal security concerns, the regime ruthlessly and effectively suppressed opposition in the early 1950s. And there really was no serious threat to the regime's survival from any internal political forces. Even as far away as Tibet, for those of you who know about the history of Tibet in China, China was able to maintain order there, maybe not in an ideal way, but despite the fact that Tibetan resistance had some support from the U.S., its covert resistance through the CIA, but had some support from the United States, the regime was able to deal with its internal security concerns, but not its external security concerns. Those of you who know about China in the 50s will know that Mao did this, but wasn't really that happy with it because he preferred to run his country as he saw fit and had some serious disagreements that emerge over time with this, the Soviet patron, was uncomfortable with China's dependence on the Soviet Union's military, and also were having to take economic development advice from Soviet advisors with whom he disagreed. So he's chafing at this dependence that China experiences in the 1950s. As the threat from the United States in China's eyes begins to diminish towards the end of the decade, Mao feels that he has some freedom to begin to contest Soviet dominance of China, or try to wriggle free of China's dependence on the Soviet Union. Those of you who study economic development will know that China tried several innovations in development policy, unhappy with the Soviet development model. Most famously, by the end of the 1950s, Mao is going to push the Great Leap Forward development strategy as a way of showing China would find its own path to socialism. In terms of military affairs, China was very determined that it should have control of its own nuclear arsenal, so China wouldn't have to depend on the Soviet Union. Both of those things contributed to disagreements with the Soviet Union that ultimately are going to break this alliance and lead to a shift in China's grand strategy. It's also going to lead to, of course, you know about the Great Leap Forward, disastrous economic consequences within China, which Mao was, and that was a price Mao was willing to pay in order to prove that China could go in its own direction, the direction he preferred. So we hit the 1960s. As I said, these PowerPoint slides are mainly for your entertainment. The 1960s, what goes on here is Mao sees the threat, the military threat from the United States is still there, but it's a low threat. Instead, Mao is going to conclude that in terms of security, let's shift from pictures to words, the American military threat is low. There's a new threat from abroad, though, in Mao's eyes by the early 1960s. And that's what he sees as the mistaken ideology of the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union has headed down the path of revisionism, as he put it, simply meaning the wrong approach to building socialism in a country from Mao's perspective. And Mao was concerned that China not follow that path and wanted to avoid China being so closely tied to the Soviet Union that they may be dragged along with the rest of the socialist camp in the wrong direction. He feared for the future of his regime in China as he envisioned it, as Mao envisioned it. So that was a security concern from abroad, the threat of Soviet ideology. Domestically, in the early 1960s, At the beginning of the decade, not so much of a concern. I guess I shouldn't put high, I should put low than high. But as those of you, again, who know about China's domestic politics in the 60s will recall, by the middle of the decade, Mao begins to conclude that the threat of revisionism, the threat that China could somehow follow the wrong path in building socialism, was no longer principally from the Soviet Union, but was coming from homegrown revisionists within the Chinese Communist Party in particular. And he ultimately takes steps that snowball into what becomes the Cultural Revolution, which was designed to eliminate those who were going to take China down the revisionist path. Mao's decision to launch what becomes the Cultural Revolution within less than a year, but within a couple of years, creates such turmoil within the country that the country is at the brink of civil war. I mean, especially in July 1967, that was really the turning point, I guess you could call it, or the point where things really got dangerous. The military looked as though they might be on the verge of mutiny. And Mao realized, you know what, I'm worried about the future of the regime because of ideological corrosion and following the revisionist path that could lead us somewhere down the road to the wrong kind of socialist China. I got an immediate problem. I got an immediate problem that the country could collapse into civil war as a consequence of the factional violence during the Cultural Revolution. So by the end of the decade, by 1967-68, Mao's focused on a internal security concern that is really one that is, a traditional security concern, not ideology, but of civil conflict that he has to address. And Mao, I guess many of you know, the military, he calls on the military basically to restore order in the country, to head off a civil war. He turns on those in the leadership who wanted to spread the Cultural Revolution to the military and says, no, the main thing is to maintain order. We need a China in which I can, still carry out my crazy ideas about building socialism in the Maoist way. Order is restored, but almost immediately thereafter, in 1969, Mao's concerns are going to change yet again, and he is going to shift to a different grand strategy, one in which China is going to align, not ally, there's no treaty, with the United States. In other words, he didn't use this term, but he's going to lean to the other side. He'd leaned to the Soviet side in the 50s. Now he's going to lean to the American side. And in doing so, he's responding to what was a change in China's security environment. And I'm going to point out how, in fact, even though this grand strategy is in place until 1981, it really goes through two different versions. The first one's when Mao's in charge. And Mao's responding to the border conflict that erupts along the Sino-Soviet border. Both sides had militarized that border in the course of the 1960s because they had a dispute about where it should be. Military skirmishes break out in 1969. Those who are involved in things like the Karelitsa War Project might want to call that a war because of the number of fatalities. It wasn't a war. If there was a war, you would have known it. We would be talking about something different. But there were border skirmishes that threatened to escalate to an all-out war. And this happened just after the Soviets had intervened in Czechoslovakia in 1968, August 1968. And the justification that Moscow gave for that becomes known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, which was, we're intervening in Czechoslovakia because there are internal changes there, the so-called Prague Spring. There are internal changes there that are taking that country down the wrong path and maybe out of the Soviet socialist camp, the wrong kind of socialism. The Chinese perspective was, we think the Soviet Union may apply that principle to us. They see turmoil in the Cultural Revolution, that they may decide to back a faction in the Chinese leadership that will return China to the Soviet fold, that will make it a more loyal ally of the Soviet Union, no longer critical of the Soviet Union as a revisionist country. So the Chinese are worried that they not only face a military threat from the Soviet Union, but that military threat is motivated by the idea of changing the color of China, as they would put it in the language of the time. It says there, 1969 to 1978, the years when Mao was in charge. One thing to point out, however, about this lean to the other side grand strategy, unlike the Sino-Soviet alliance, Mao, and this is why this is going to be put in two different versions, Mao was not going to allow China to really integrate itself with the capitalist world economically. That doesn't happen in this approach that Mao's taking. He just wants the Americans as a military counterweight against the Soviet Union. That is going to change after Mao's gone and after a brief interregnum with Hua Guofeng. Of course, Deng Xiaoping and the reformers take over. And what's going to happen here? They inherit a security situation that's still very dangerous, and indeed it's going to spike and become even more dangerous briefly when China invades Vietnam and is worried that the Vietnamese ally, the Soviet Union, might take military action against China. So he leans even closer to the United States. It's a motivation for normalizing diplomatic relations with the United States on January 1st, 1979. It's also, and I guess this, we'll try not to get off on a tangent here, but this is the moment when China is forced to agree to permit the United States to continue selling arms to Taiwan even after normalization. Something we want to return to, but we'll get back to that. Anyway, so Deng Xiaoping still has to lean to the United States because of the Soviet military threat. But Deng Xiaoping at this time, and those around him, I'm just naming him because he was first among several, at the same time was very concerned about the internal security concern. The legacy of the last decade plus of Mao's rule, really from the Great Leap Forward on, but especially the latter years of the Cultural Revolution decade, was widespread cynicism and disillusionment among the Chinese people. A lot of people felt as though that, the Byzantine palace politics of the various factions in the leadership struggling to succeed Chairman Mao and then struggling after Chairman Mao passed from the scene. These were affairs that, to them, suggested the regime was really no longer serving the people, no longer really looking out for the good of the Chinese people. So Deng and those around him realized they had a big domestic problem in terms of legitimacy, and they couldn't count on running the country for the long haul by relying simply on coercion, military force, and police power. And this is just a couple of pictures. If you don't know, on the left this is Democracy Wall. That's a poster of Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, one of the Gang of Four that gets purged. Everybody was for that, but still that was not enough to regain the confidence of the Chinese people, some of whom were beginning to talk about ideas of political reform, including liberal democracy, which Deng and those around him really saw as that would be the death knell for Leninist rule by the Communist Party. Deng and those around him are going to crack down on Democracy Wall, but they know they still have a problem. To deal with that internal threat, the regime in the reform era, in this period up until 1981, makes a shift from Mao's approach and says, not only are we leaning on the U.S. militarily because of the Soviet Union, but we're also going to open up the country and begin integrating with the Western world, not becoming dependent on it the way China was dependent on the Soviet Union in the 50s. But the reason for doing this was not just because they wanted to do the opposite of what Chairman Mao did, but because they saw this as the only way in which the regime could enhance its tenuous legitimacy among the Chinese people, to enhance stability at home by improving the living standard of the Chinese people. That was part of the motivation for integrating economically with the outside world in this grand strategy. It would serve the domestic political purpose. The other purpose it would serve was a military one, which was if China is ever going to get to the point that it doesn't have to depend on other countries for its security by aligning with them or leaning towards them, China's going to have a modern military. You don't get a modern military unless you have a modern economy. And so we have to integrate with the outside world to gain the science and technology and ultimately the economic foundation for building our military power. That's until 1981. But things are going to change yet again under Deng Xiaoping. He's going to have a transformed perception. He's in charge. He's going to get to guide the grand strategy. After 1981, the Chinese, before people in the West, saw that the Soviet Union was spent, especially as a consequence of its involvement in Afghanistan, but also the failings of its economy, its arms race with the United States. They saw in this period of the 1982 to 92, a period where the Soviet threat to China, the military threat it posed, was much diminished. And next slide, I guess. If you don't know, it's far enough in the past, maybe people don't know this guy anymore. That's Mikhail Gorbachev, last head of the Soviet Union. I assume people know who Deng Xiaoping is. So what's going on in this period? It says hedging. So external security threats look lower than they were in the 1970s. Internal security concerns have also been declining because of the success of the economic reform program in the 1980s, except for what everybody knows, kind of the elephant in the room or whatever here, what happens between 1989 and 1992. You have that spike right after the crackdown in Tiananmen Square and throughout China against those pushing for more aggressive reforms, especially political reforms by the regime. During those years, the regime was solely focused on restoring order at home. But Deng and those around him in this period are still not going to alter their grand strategy, which was simply to hedge against the possibility that an external military threat could arise and remain committed to modernizing the economy for political, for performance legitimacy reasons, to use jargon, but also to hope to one day build a stronger military. By 1992, China's real isolation from the outside world is ending. China's domestic situation is stabilized, maybe tenuously, but stabilized after the crackdown in Tiananmen Square. And those of you, again, who know your Chinese history know that is when Deng Xiaoping concludes the time has come to reinvigorate our push for modernization and economic reform. He goes on a famous tour of the southern part of China. It's symbolic, but it's basically him saying, let's go, guys. It's time. Now we had to pause while we restored domestic political order after Tiananmen Square, but now it's time to move ahead with our modernization program. And so you get the beginning. You know, the last years when Deng Xiaoping is in control, and then his successors, you get about 15 years of what probably should be labeled an independent foreign policy. By the Soviet Union collapses, the regime doesn't see a big threat from the United States and believes, well, it looks as though the international security environment's fairly peaceful and relaxed. We no longer have to depend on others. We can craft an independent foreign policy, as every country would prefer to do. We can craft an independent foreign policy for China. And this goes through, I have it written down here somewhere, a number of phases. How many do I do? 3 phases. So you'll get 3 pictures. The first phase, 1993, as Jiang Zemin, picture here, begins to take over for Deng Xiaoping as the most important political leader in the country. In this first phase, from 93 to 96, China's approach is probably best labeled hide and bide. I didn't pick those terms. Those of you know Tao Guang Yang Hui. It's a saying that's been interpreted in various ways. Usually it's hide and bide. Hide our strength and hide our capabilities, bide our time, something like that. But what's going on here in the first few years after the shift to an independent foreign policy is basically an attempt to return to what Deng Xiaoping had in mind in the 1980s. Improve domestic security by raising the standard of living of the Chinese people, more economic reform, greater openness to the outside world, economic engagement, as the only way to ensure China's external security. And so it says their external security concerns low but rising. I'll explain why in a second. Internal security concerns high but falling because this is coming out of the Tiananmen Square events. But as the economy picks up yet again, that diffuses some of the anger at the regime for the crackdown. And another thing that's going on in this period was the inauguration of the so-called patriotic education campaign, in which, in the educational system, the regime is trying to tap into and nurture a strong sense of Chinese nationalism and portray the Communist Party as the champions of Chinese nationalism as a way of rallying the people there. In this period, and this is why it says low but rising for external security concerns. It's a good news, bad news story in terms of how this first phase of the independent foreign policy plays out. The good news was the economy took off in the 1990s. If anybody hasn't read the book by Arthur Kroeber that came out this year on the Chinese economy, he does a great job of talking about how the economy really took off in the 1990s. Military modernization was finally beginning to benefit, not only from more money being thrown at the military after Tiananmen Square, but also as a consequence of the country's economic development. That's the good news for the regime. The bad news for the regime was the country is becoming richer and more powerful. It wasn't all that rich or powerful yet, but yet its neighbors were worried about, oh, well, what's a rich and powerful China going to mean for us? And began worrying about China and perhaps how China would behave as it emerged, if it became a great power. The reaction, I won't go into this in much detail, some of you who might know my work know that I've dealt with this at length elsewhere. The reaction from the United States and other countries in East Asia was worry about what China's rise would mean. And this really worried China's leaders. They said, well, we're still relatively poor and weak, and you guys talk about a China threat. How is that possible? And so what's going to happen is the regime's going to respond to those, what they saw as the deterioration in their external security environment by shifting, still an independent foreign policy, to an approach that you can label peaceful rise or peaceful development, whatever you want to call it. The logic is clear. The idea here is, well, we're not going to do what we did during the Cold War. That doesn't make sense, which was, we balanced against external threats by joining with another country. The Soviets in the 50s, the Americans in the 70s. Instead, what China is going to do, because it's not strong enough yet to really counter big external security problems on its own. It can't really deal with the United States if the United States is going to be a problem on its own. So the regime decides its best approach is to try to convince others that it doesn't pose a threat, to diffuse the external threats through a very determined policy of reassurance in various forms. And I won't go into much detail because I can see time is wasting. But basically, China doesn't just walk the walk, doesn't just talk the talk, it walks the walk. It takes a number of steps, concrete steps in economic affairs and in security affairs to demonstrate that China really is going to be what eventually Robert Zoellick would label a responsible stakeholder in the international system. In other words, don't worry about China's growing wealth and power. You'll be okay because we don't pose a threat. Worked pretty darn well from 1997 to 2008. Foreign trade and investment, foreign trade with and investment in China boomed. The economy boomed as well. It helped secure China's domestic political position, in other words, getting performance legitimacy at home. And it was funding an increasingly impressive program of military modernization, setting the stage for China to become a true major military power. It was going so well, in fact, that there were analysts in Washington, D.C. and some other capitals of American allies in Asia who talked about being concerned that China was eating our lunch, as they put it. That without scaring anybody, China was quietly on the brink, maybe, of replacing the United States as the leading power in the Asia-Pacific region. And that worried Americans. But it turned out no need to worry, because in 2008, 2009, these are somewhat artificial dates. This is when Hu Jintao is entering his second term as president of China, and Barack Obama is in office. Call this the strategic stumble. It says assertiveness up there. It's a good thing I did spell check. I'm looking at this saying, did I spell assertive right? Okay. Call this a strategic stumble. Remember Mao's strategic stumble in the 60s when he went on his independent foreign policy and that caused all kinds of problems. This is a different kind of stumble. And it was really puzzling because people thought, wow, why is China starting to do these things that are damaging China's security position when things were going so great up until 2008? And I'll skip the part about maybe why China made this shift. You can do it in the Q&A if people want. But the bottom line here is China began doing things like reasserting its claims in the South China Sea more aggressively, confronting Japan over disputed territory in the East China Sea, not playing ball and dealing with North Korea's bad behavior when it sank a South Korean ship and then shelled a South Korean island. It's like China's foreign policy in this period after 2009, a foreign policy that had looked very nimble and deft over the preceding decade, all of a sudden looked clumsy and ham-fisted. And what happens is other countries are alarmed, and this time other countries really do begin to align themselves against China in some respects. You get the American rebalance to Asia, or what some people call the pivot. You get countries that are allied with the United States, and even one that's not, Vietnam, begin turning to Washington and saying, please, we want you to be more engaged and help us deal with what we see as growing Chinese aggressiveness or assertiveness. What this all meant from the perspective of China's leaders was, oh no, our worst nightmare, the nightmare that drove us to do the peaceful rise thing, that nightmare is coming true. People are beginning to see China as a threat and doing something about it. And so that's why it says external security concerns low at the beginning, but rising as a consequence of China's actions and the reaction to China's actions. Internal security concerns, oh yeah, they're also going to rise. At the beginning of this period, in 2007, 2008, just when the Olympics take place, in 2008, things were pretty good at home for the Chinese Communist Party. They were in a pretty good position. They were secure. But in addition to the outside world beginning to push back against China after 2008, Starting in 2008, China began to face increasing domestic security problems, beginning with Tibet in 2008. For those of you who know the events around the time of the Olympics in March, well, it's before the Olympics, but in March 2008, you had, I don't know what you want to call it, riots and uprising, whatever it is, violence in Tibet, which suggested, that Tibet is still a problem for the regime. In the years after 2008, you had more unrest in Xinjiang, and you had some attacks by Uyghurs from Xinjiang going to other parts of China, and as the years go by, those attacks reach all the way to Beijing and all the way to the southeastern part of the country. What does the regime think when it sees these internal challenges? The Communist Party does what maybe it always would do in these situations. It connects them to its external security concerns. On every one of these occasions, this actually happened with Tiananmen Square as well, the Communist Party claims we've got problem in Tibet, we've got problem in Xinjiang. These problems are a result of hostile foreign forces that are stirring up trouble in these places. And so they attack who? The Dalai Lama and his friends for what's going on in Tibet. They attack Rebbe Kadir for the problems in Xinjiang. And they attack the National Endowment for Democracy in the United States because it funds some of Rebbe Kadir's activities. The bigger problem with respect to Xinjiang in terms of hostile foreign forces, though, this is now taking place in a changed world where outside of China you have the global jihadist movement, whatever you want to call it, and the Chinese see connections between unrest in Xinjiang, some of the violence there and outside of Xinjiang and China, tied to al-Qaeda and ultimately to the Islamic State. So here we go, 2009 to 2012. Things are turning sour for China. I mean, I think everybody who was living through that time saw China's foreign policy as becoming more and more problematic. And that's the situation that Xi Jinping is going to walk into. Not really walk into, he's going to fight for his right to be the #1 guy in China. He's going to beat back any challenges that might have existed. He's going to eliminate Bo Xilai and all that stuff. But Xi Jinping emerges in a context where China faces a pretty tough situation. And I'm going to make the argument here that what Xi Jinping is trying to do is craft ultimately what could be called a great power strategy with Chinese characteristics, just so I can sound like I'm talking like the Chinese. What's he want to do? He wants to mitigate this difficult situation that China finds itself in. Almost immediately after Xi Jinping becomes both chairman of the country, the president of the country, and also general secretary of the party, in June 2013, one of the first foreign actions that Xi Jinping takes is his trip to the Caribbean and then meeting with President Obama at Sunnylands in California, where he tries to convince the president that, we got to mend fences, we have to build a new type great power relationship. It's June 2013. October 2013, he gives a major speech, Xi Jinping does, in which he calls for improving China's handling of its relations with regional neighbors, basically an admission that we've been screwing up for the last 5 years or so in dealing with ASEAN countries. November 2014, he gives an important address to a relatively rare Central Conference on Work relating to foreign affairs that struck a much more conciliatory tone about China's posture in the region and towards the outside world. So he knows what he wants to do, but Xi Jinping realizes it's not going to be easy because China and the world were different in 2013 and 14 than they were in 2007 and 2008 when China went off the rails, so to speak. First of all, there was no way that Xi Jinping was going to be able to reprise the early post-Cold War approach of Deng Xiaoping, the idea of kind of laying low and hiding and biding and all that stuff. China's international role was too big for that. They could no longer lay low. They were too visible. So that was maintaining a low profile, that's not a possibility. Secondly, he couldn't even really go back to the old Jiang Zemin approach and the early Hu Jintao approach, which was the peaceful rise thing of reassuring neighbors. There are a few people in this audience that are old enough to remember this. There used to be a TV commercial before cable TV even for a dandruff shampoo in the United States called Head & Shoulders. And the tagline in the commercial, probably designed by people on Madison Avenue, the Mad Men folks and all that, with the dandruff shampoo was, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. And China and Xi's problem was, you can't start to try reassuring people that China won't pose a challenge or threat to you ever as it becomes powerful and rich, because China's neighbors, and the United States as well, had seen what China had done from 2008 to 2013. And so it was not going to be possible to turn back the clock and get a fresh start on reassuring neighbors. So if you're Xi Jinping, what do? This, what I'm labeling this great power strategy with Chinese characteristics. You do a number of things. And it says here, China's external, the threats to China are not high. They're manageable, but they've got to be managed. Internal security concerns for the regime are high and complex, as I'll detail further in a moment. First of all, what the strategy is going to do is that Xi and his colleagues understand they have to face up to the challenges of coping with a more difficult external security environment in which there's nothing that China can do to keep others from being worried about China's rise and its implications. Second, China has to simply give up on the idea that it can stop others from hedging against the fears they have about China. They're going to hedge against an uncertain future. It's understandable. We're not going to be able to prevent that from happening. Third, Xi Jinping and those around him accept that all that Beijing can really do is to try to manage the internal and external risks the regime faces as a consequence of China's success, as a consequence of becoming such a more important and influential international actor, both economically and militarily. You're not going to solve that problem, that challenge of managing the perception of China's rise. You can only manage it. And fourth element here is, but we'll try to reassure others. It's not going to be fully successful, but it sure makes sense to try to diffuse the perception of China as a problem actor. And then fifth, and this is probably the takeaway item for most analysts, if others remain skeptical about China's intentions, and if cooperation proves unworkable, this new approach by China anticipates that the Communist Party, leading an increasingly powerful China, should and will do whatever it decides is necessary to ensure China's interests. In other words, be prepared for the possibility that China will simply have to fend for itself and defend its interests. So that's the approach. As it says on the PowerPoint slide there, it says high but complex internal security challenges. You bet. Because in addition to all this international kind of security concerns that China is generating, those of you who know about China today will know that Xi Jinping comes into office at a time when the regime had concluded that their economic development strategy had run its course, that it's going to have to be a new round of reforms that were going to be very difficult, that were going to be painful at home, that were probably going to result in a lower rate of growth while the reforms are being implemented. And that meant that relying for performance legitimacy, for getting the support of the Chinese people on maintaining real high growth rates, incomes rising all the time and stuff, that's going to be more difficult for the regime if it's going to pursue these reforms that it believes are necessary for entering a sustainable path of economic development. And secondly, Xi and those around him, in terms of internal security concerns, face a much more challenging connection between domestic and international security. Internal and external security from their perception, from their perspective, which is really the continuing consequence of China's engagement with the outside world. Chinese leaders had always seen this connection. Mao worried about the silver-coated bullets of the bourgeoisie, meaning influences from the outside world corrupting China. Deng Xiaoping and those around him every once in a while worried about spiritual pollution or bourgeois liberalization coming from the outside world as China opened up. But they were able to Mao could manage it because the country's closed off. Deng could manage it in the time when he was around. Xi and those around him today understand they face a much more difficult task, given the changes in technology, given the integration of China with the outside world economically and in terms of educational opportunities and all that stuff. The regime, in part, as I'm sure everybody knows, relies partly on trying to harshly control what they see as negative domestic political consequences from China's opening up. But they also know that they confront a tension. Given the regime's reliance on performance legitimacy at home, the regime also then faces a tension between its political agenda of control and its economic agenda of openness. And it's a tension that the regime has really not yet figured out exactly how it's going to manage it. They can't really completely control all of the consequences of modern technology and yet integrate China fully into the global economy, assuming we'll still have an integrated global economy in the coming years. But you know, there is this tension. Political control desires, but also the need for economic openness. There's also a tension, by the way, between avoiding the disastrous consequences of military conflict if China winds up in a real military conflict, because it's certainly possible, and if it happens, China will certainly lose, unless they're fighting, you know, the Philippines alone. But if it involves the United States or some of the other countries, China will be significantly damaged and almost certainly lose a military engagement. But the regime can't afford to back down in international confrontations as a consequence of now having tapped so heavily into the sense of Chinese nationalism, patriotic education campaign. That puts the regime in another difficult spot that links its domestic security to its international security problems and concerns. So let me wrap up with just a couple of comments here, and I apologize for running a bit long. The security concerns of the Chinese Communist Party today that include links between external and internal threats to the regime's survival are really new manifestations of a long-standing concern in the People's Republic of China. The new wrinkles in the 21st century are a consequence of really two big things. One, the end of the Cold War and a changed international order. But perhaps more importantly, the second thing is the fruits of China's remarkably successful modernization since 1979. That's led to openness, it's led to China's enrichment, its growing economic wealth, but also its power that makes some others nervous. And China's success to this point has really yielded new problems for the regime, testing the ability of China's leaders today, most importantly Xi Jinping, testing their ability to see if they can handle the complex challenges they face as a more powerful China and still preserve the Communist Party's position as the ruling force within the People's Republic of China. So I will cut myself off there. Thank you, and take your questions and comments and criticisms.